When my fiancée gave a toast saying that I was just her plan B, so she got a one-way ticket, her parents were enraged, but it was too late. The day started like any other wedding might. A flurry of preparations, the buzz of last-minute adjustments, and the orchestrated dance of people doing their best to create an illusion of seamless perfection. The ceremony itself had gone off without a hitch. The vows had been spoken, the applause had followed, and we made our way to the reception, where guests were already settling in for a carefully planned evening of celebration. From a strategic standpoint, everything had been laid out precisely. Emily and I had invested a considerable amount of time and money into making sure that this day ran smoothly. The venue, an elegant manor with sprawling gardens, was exactly what we'd envisioned. Our guest list had been carefully curated, composed of a mix of family, close friends, and the necessary business contacts that had to be there for appearances. Every detail had been accounted for, from the lighting that softened as the sun began to set, to the arrangement of the tables that allowed for optimal conversation flow. As we moved through the typical formalities, our entrance as newlyweds, the first dance, the cutting of the cake, I focused on keeping everything in line. I ensured that the photographer captured the moments that mattered, that the caterers stuck to the timeline, and that everyone in attendance was satisfied. Managing this event, I realized, was as important as being part of it. We were on display, not just for ourselves, but for everyone who had come to witness the culmination of this relationship. When it came time for the speeches, my attention remained on logistics. The best man's toast, delivered by my brother David, was brief but heartfelt. He stuck to the script, offering just the right mix of humor and sentimentality without veering into anything too personal or unplanned. It was the sort of speech that would leave no room for awkwardness, no surprises, and certainly nothing out of place. When he finished, the applause was automatic. I nodded in his direction, acknowledging the effort and the execution. Emily stood up next. I anticipated a simple thank you to everyone for attending, a few words about our future, and perhaps some sentimental remarks to wrap up the formal part of the evening. As she began speaking, my attention drifted back to the guests. I surveyed the room, ensuring that all was as it should be. The tables were full, people were engaged, and the background music was starting to fade to an appropriate level for her speech. Everything was in order, but her words took an unexpected turn. At first, I didn't register the gravity of what she said. It wasn't until I caught the shifting energy in the room, the subtle drop in conversation, the glances exchanged between guests, that I returned my full focus to her. She had just uttered something about always loving my brother. It sounded odd, completely out of place, like a joke that didn't land. The silence in the room, however, confirmed that no one found this humorous. I looked at Emily, expecting her to follow this up with an explanation, perhaps a laugh or a clarifying statement that would alleviate the confusion. Instead, her tone remained steady, her expression unchanging. There was no laugh, no correction. She continued speaking, as if what she just said was a natural part of the speech. I remained seated, calculating the situation. The room had fallen into an uncomfortable stillness. I scanned the guests again, this time with more intensity, watching their reactions. The faces around the room ranged from shocked to confused, but all eyes were on me. I knew what was expected next. People were waiting for my response, waiting to see how I would handle this breach of protocol, this disruption of the day's careful order. I stood up, motioning to Emily to stop speaking, though I didn't say a word. The gesture alone was enough to halt her mid-sentence. Still, she didn't seem confused or panicked. She simply stopped talking and looked at me, waiting. The guest's eyes followed my every move as I stepped forward and made an announcement. The wedding was off. There was no hesitation in my voice, no faltering in my stance. I'd made the decision quickly, and I executed it with precision. The gasps from the crowd were immediate, but I didn't acknowledge them. My focus was on removing myself from the situation as efficiently as possible. I left the room without further explanation, knowing that the consequences would unfold in their own time. Once outside the reception hall, I kept walking, away from the commotion and away from the noise. My thoughts remained clear, detached even. There was no need for deliberation, no need for emotional processing in that moment. The situation was simple. Emily had made a choice to say what she said, and I had responded accordingly. I had no intention of giving her or anyone else the opportunity to create a narrative that would excuse her behavior or attempt to salvage the event. The wedding was over. As I left the venue, I mentally mapped out my next steps. First, I would need to inform my immediate family. David would need to be addressed separately, of course, but I would save that for later. For now, my focus was on damage control. The guests would need to be notified, the vendors would have to be dealt with, and the legal logistics of canceling everything would take priority. I contacted the event planner and gave her a clear directive. The evening was to be brought to an immediate halt. The vendors would still be paid, but the reception was to end right then and there. There would be no explanations offered to the guests, no statements issued. I left that responsibility to the planner and instructed her to handle the situation with professionalism and tact. Next, I called the hotel where Emily and I were supposed to be spending the night, canceling the reservation. I contacted the honeymoon travel agency to cancel the trip as well. There was no point in keeping any of the arrangements in place. I knew Emily's family would soon be contacting me, but I had no intention of answering their calls. They could deal with the fallout in their own way. I returned to my home, where I would begin the process of undoing everything that had been set in motion for the wedding. This was not a situation that could be left to fester or linger. Action was required, and I had no intention of letting this event spiral further out of control. I began drafting the necessary emails to inform our vendors of the wedding's cancellation, ensuring that all financial matters would be settled promptly and without dispute. There was no room for ambiguity in the decisions I was making. The guest list would be handled next. I composed a brief message to be sent to everyone who had attended, offering no apologies, no explanations, just a factual statement that the wedding had been called off. The reasons were irrelevant. What mattered was that the event was over, and there was no point in prolonging any questions or concerns. I would deal with Emily and her family when the time came, but for now, my focus remained on executing the immediate steps necessary to bring the entire affair to a close. My decision had been made, and I would not be swayed by any arguments or attempts at reconciliation. The day was over, and the future I had once planned was no longer relevant. Strategically, I knew that the faster I acted, the less room there would be for interference or emotional manipulation. The situation was already volatile, but I intended to stay ahead of it. There was no room for hesitation or regret in this process. It was simply a matter of cutting ties and ensuring that I maintained control over what came next. After calling off the wedding, the next phase of the situation unfolded with predictable chaos, but I stayed focused. The immediate fallout needed to be contained, and I had no intention of letting the disaster spiral any further out of my control. My decisions were already in motion, and each step forward would be calculated, detached from the emotions of the moment. Once I returned home, I opened my calendar and systematically began canceling all the arrangements for the next few days. The hotel booking for the honeymoon was the first item. The cancellation policy was strict, but I didn't care about the financial loss. That was insignificant compared to what was at stake. I contacted the travel agency and canceled all the flights and accommodations for the honeymoon. I also ensured that any future correspondence from the agency would come directly to me and not Emily. There would be no room for misunderstandings or miscommunications. Next, I dealt with the financial obligations tied to the wedding. The vendors who had provided their services would need to be paid, and I wasn't about to leave those loose ends hanging. I went through the contracts with each vendor, caterers, photographers, the florist, the band. I made sure the payments were settled in full where necessary, ensuring that no one could claim I had acted unfairly. This was purely a transactional matter now. The wedding was over, but business arrangements still needed to be honored. I focused on the remaining tasks like a project manager closing out an event. The guest list was next on my agenda. I'd already sent a message informing everyone that the wedding had been canceled. But now, with the dust settling, I needed to think about future interactions with those same people. I decided to take control of the narrative. Without engaging in any direct conversation, I instructed my assistant to manage any follow-up communication. She was to remain professional, neutral, and non-committal. I wouldn't allow gossip to spread unchecked or for anyone to gain control of the story. There were business connections on that guest list, people whose opinions I valued not for their personal significance, but for their professional influence. For those individuals, I drafted a more formal explanation of the situation, sticking to the facts. I was firm and concise. The wedding had been canceled, and there would be no further comment. Any attempts to pry into the details would be met with silence. These were people who would respect professionalism and discretion, so I left no room for them to engage further. Emily's family became the next issue. I knew her parents would be furious. They had poured significant resources into this wedding, expecting it to be a spectacle that would elevate their social standing. Their investments were not just financial, but also reputational. I anticipated their reaction. The calls from Emily's mother and started pouring in within hours of my departure from the venue. I ignored them at first. Responding emotionally to their anger wouldn't serve my goals, so I took my time before addressing them. When I did, it was with precision. I sent an email to Anne and Martin, thanking them for their efforts in preparing for the wedding, but making it clear that the event was over. The arrangements they had made would no longer be necessary, and I advised them to cancel any plans that were still pending. I expressed no regrets, gave no explanations, and offered no apologies. It was a businesslike approach to an otherwise personal situation, but that was the only way to handle it. Knowing that they would inevitably try to push back, I preemptively contacted the lawyers. I wanted to ensure that nothing from this wedding, financially or otherwise, could come back to haunt me. The prenuptial agreement I had Emily sign early on, at her family's insistence, would be vital. I reviewed it thoroughly, scanning for any loopholes that might leave me vulnerable. Satisfied with the language in the document, I authorized my legal team to be on standby, anticipating the possibility of claims from Emily's side, however unlikely. The next day, the media became a new concern. The wedding had attracted attention beyond just family and friends. Given the scale and the people involved, it was inevitable that questions would start circulating. I knew I needed to manage this proactively. I contacted my PR team and instructed them to release a simple, non-dramatic statement. The wedding had been canceled due to unforeseen circumstances, and both parties were now focusing on moving forward. That was all the public needed to know. To ensure that no further details leaked, I took additional steps. I issued a confidentiality directive to the vendors and planners who had been involved. They were legally bound to maintain privacy about anything they had witnessed during the wedding day, especially regarding the last-minute cancellation. Breaches would result in financial penalties. While it may have seemed overcautious, I wasn't going to let any unnecessary chatter fuel a rumor mill. Emily herself was a variable I couldn't completely predict, but I approached it with a similar mindset. She hadn't yet reached out directly to me since the reception. Her parents had done all the communication so far, but I knew it was only a matter of time before she would. My strategy was simple. I would not engage until I was ready, and I wouldn't be drawn into any discussions where emotions might compromise my position. For now, I kept all communications one-sided and documented. My next strategic decision was to focus on controlling my immediate surroundings. My home had to remain a fortress, both literally and figuratively. The house that had been meant to be our shared marital space would no longer serve that purpose, so I took measures to secure my privacy. I informed the security team to limit access to any visitors, and I disconnected any accounts that Emily or her family might have had access to. From utilities to shared subscriptions, everything was untangled and removed. It was essential to cut ties with precision. Professionally, I couldn't let this situation bleed into my work life. I took immediate steps to compartmentalize, ensuring that none of this mess interfered with my business. I had meetings scheduled over the coming days, and I intended to attend them as usual. The narrative I would project was one of stability, calmness, and resilience. People in my field respected those who could maintain control under pressure, and that was exactly what I would demonstrate. To that end, I delegated any personal matters to my assistant. She was to handle incoming messages, coordinate with the lawyers and PR team, and ensure that I was shielded from unnecessary distractions. My focus remained on the execution of my professional responsibilities, while the personal fallout was dealt with efficiently in the background. The less I allowed this situation to touch my professional life, the more credibility I retained in both spheres. Another factor to consider was my family. My parents, in particular, would be shaken by the abrupt end to the wedding. I was their first son to marry, and the pride they had felt in witnessing the events beginning had quickly turned into confusion. But I wasn't ready to deal with the emotional side of things. For now, I issued a brief statement to my family, explaining that the wedding had been called off and that I preferred not to discuss it further until the dust had settled. I knew they would respect my boundaries for the time being. David, my brother, was a separate matter. His role in Emily's shocking confession lingered in the background, though I chose not to address it immediately. There would be a time and place to confront that situation, but for now, my priority was keeping everything under control. I knew David would feel uncomfortable with the weight of the unresolved situation, but I wasn't going to engage with him until I had full clarity on my next steps. The last thing I needed was more unpredictability, and involving him now could stir up complications I wasn't ready to address. Each day following the wedding brought new developments, but I had anticipated most of them. It was only a matter of executing my decisions with precision and ensuring that everything stayed on track. By maintaining control over the narrative, the logistics, and the financial aspects, I minimized the potential for long-term damage. For now, my approach was purely external. The goal was to contain the fallout, remove any leverage Emily's family might try to exploit, and keep my life on course. The emotional side of things was a distraction I didn't have the luxury of dealing with yet. What mattered was keeping everything moving forward and preventing this disaster from derailing more than just the wedding. In the days following the wedding, the external situation continued to evolve, and I made it my priority to remain in control of every aspect. The uncertainty that came from Emily's public admission about her feelings for David had left me with more questions than answers. However, rather than confront these ambiguities head-on with emotion, I focused on facts and maintaining order in my personal and professional life. The next steps required careful planning, calculated moves, and ensuring that I wouldn't be blindsided by anything unexpected. The first task was to continue managing the legal and logistical fallout of the canceled wedding. Emily's family had escalated their complaints and frustrations. They sent a series of messages and emails demanding explanations, claiming financial grievances, and attempting to shift blame onto me for the event's abrupt end. Their behavior was predictable, and I didn't engage with them directly. Instead, I forwarded all correspondence to my legal team and instructed them to draft formal responses. These responses were factual, impersonal, and addressed the legal matters at hand, settling costs, reimbursing certain amounts, and clarifying that any further communication should go through legal channels. Emily's parents had clearly invested a lot in the wedding, but that wasn't my concern. I was determined not to be drawn into any emotional or financial traps. My approach was to sever ties completely, not to negotiate. Any claims they had about what was owed were irrelevant. The wedding was off, and so were the relationships that came with it. I ensured that my lawyers handled all future communication, minimizing any direct involvement from me. This was another matter of control. By delegating these interactions to professionals, I removed the potential for emotional manipulation. In parallel, I needed to decide how to handle the growing tensions within my own family, specifically regarding my brother David. The situation between Emily and him had cast a shadow over everything, and while I wasn't ready to confront it head-on yet, I couldn't ignore the fact that it lingered in the background. There were strategic decisions to be made about how to approach this. David hadn't reached out to me in the days following the wedding. His silence was telling, but I didn't jump to conclusions just yet. It was clear that Emily's confession had unsettled him as much as it had the rest of us, but I didn't know to what extent he had been aware of her feelings before that day. I needed to gather information before making any decisions about how to proceed. I began by reaching out to mutual friends who had been present at the wedding, careful to frame my inquiries in a neutral way. My goal was simple: gather as much factual information as possible without giving away too much of my own thoughts. I wanted to know what others had observed, how Emily and David had interacted, whether there had been any indication of inappropriate behavior between them in the past, and whether anyone had noticed anything unusual leading up to the wedding. This wasn't about seeking validation or support. It was about gathering data to make informed decisions. The feedback I received from those friends was mixed. Some had noticed that Emily and David had always been close, but no one seemed to think it was more than a normal sibling-in-law relationship. Others admitted they had never paid much attention. Still, the uncertainty persisted. One thing was clear: No one had seen Emily's confession coming, not even David, according to those who had spoken with him after the event. But that didn't necessarily mean there wasn't more to the story. I had to remain cautious. Once I had gathered what I could from outside sources, I took the next step. I arranged a meeting with David. It wasn't an emotional confrontation. I wasn't ready to deal with that aspect of things yet, but rather a calculated move to clear the air and determine what his involvement had been. The meeting was scheduled for a neutral location, away from family or any place that might trigger personal memories. I made sure to keep it professional, treating it almost like a business meeting. David, for his part, maintained that he had been unaware of Emily's feelings for him. He expressed his own confusion over the situation and claimed that her public admission had shocked him as much as it had shocked me. While I didn't press him too hard for specifics during this initial meeting, I made it clear that I expected full transparency moving forward. I left the meeting with a sense of caution. David's story was plausible, but I wasn't ready to trust him completely yet. After that meeting, I decided to focus on the next phase, securing my own social and professional reputation in the wake of the canceled wedding. Given that many high-profile individuals had attended the event, I knew there would be rumors and speculations about what had happened. I couldn't allow gossip to tarnish my image, particularly when business relationships could be affected by public perception. Reputation management became a key priority. I worked closely with my public relations team to craft a carefully worded statement that was distributed to a select group of individuals, those who had attended the wedding and those within my professional circle. The message was straightforward and factual. The wedding had been called off due to private matters between the two families, and there would be no further comment on the situation. It was important to maintain a clear, concise narrative that allowed no room for interpretation or speculation. Additionally, I took steps to ensure that no unauthorized statements or details about the wedding would leak from any of the vendors or personnel who had been involved. I issued non-disclosure agreements, NDAs, retroactively to all parties, making it clear that any breach of confidentiality regarding the events of the day would result in legal consequences. This proactive measure was designed to minimize the chance of details being shared with the media or social circles. As the days passed, I remained focused on external matters. Emily's family continued to send messages through their legal representatives, trying to negotiate settlements or claim damages. I stuck to my original strategy, instructing my lawyers to handle everything and rejecting any attempts at personal communication. They were persistent, but I had anticipated this. For them, this wedding had been more about social status and financial gain than genuine emotion. Now that their plans had fallen apart, they were scrambling to salvage whatever they could. To further protect myself from any long-term fallout, I made arrangements to secure my financial assets. While Emily and I hadn't merged our finances entirely before the wedding, there had been discussions about future joint investments. I quickly moved to close any accounts or investments that were in any way connected to her or her family. These precautions weren't based on paranoia, but rather strategic foresight. I didn't want any potential claims to arise from our previous financial discussions. It was better to sever all possible ties now than deal with complications later. As my external strategy unfolded, I remained vigilant. The situation was volatile, and while I had made significant progress in containing the immediate damage, I knew that unexpected developments could still arise. My focus stayed on maintaining control, making sure that no outside forces could destabilize the plans I had set in motion. There would be no room for error, no loose ends left untied. Through it all, I avoided delving into the emotional complexities of the situation. That wasn't a priority at the moment. The facts were clear. Emily's confession had ended the wedding, and my responsibility now was to manage the fallout in a way that preserved my life, my business, and my reputation. Strategic decisions took precedence over everything else. I would deal with the personal consequences when the time was right. For now, I continued moving forward with precision, knowing that each calculated step brought me closer to resolving this crisis. The initial steps in dismantling the wedding arrangements and ensuring that my life continued smoothly had gone as planned, but the external challenges weren't over. The fallout from Emily's sudden confession was still echoing through both our families, and now the situation was moving into a more complex phase, one that required strategic precision on multiple fronts: legal, financial, and social. I focused on executing these decisions with the same detachment I had used up to this point. The first major challenge I faced was the legal confrontation with Emily's family. After their initial attempts to contact me directly failed, they escalated the situation by involving their legal team. It wasn't entirely surprising. Her parents had a lot invested in the wedding, financially and socially, and they weren't going to let it dissolve without trying to recover something. Their claims, however, were baseless. They demanded reimbursement for expenses they had incurred during the wedding planning process and threatened legal action if I didn't agree to compensate them. I immediately shifted the responsibility to my lawyers. Their strategy was clear. There was no legal obligation on my part to provide any further compensation. The prenuptial agreement had been ironclad, protecting both parties, and there were no shared assets or contracts between myself and Emily's family that could be contested. I had been careful from the start to avoid any entanglement of finances, knowing full well the kind of people I was dealing with. In response to their demands, my lawyers drafted a clear, concise statement rejecting their claims. We cited the prenuptial agreement, the wedding contracts, and the lack of any formal agreements between the two families. It was airtight. There was no avenue for them to pursue legal action without significant risk and cost on their part. However, knowing that they wouldn't give up easily, I authorized my legal team to prepare for potential litigation anyway, ensuring we would be fully ready to counter any lawsuits if they decided to press forward out of desperation or spite. In parallel, I began insulating myself further from potential financial fallout. Emily and her family had access to a number of personal details through the wedding planning process, contacts, addresses, and other private information that could be exploited. I tightened security around all my accounts, both personal and professional. I had my financial advisors review all bank accounts, investments, and assets to ensure that there were no vulnerabilities. Passwords were changed, access permissions were revoked, and all digital records that Emily or her family might have had access to were locked down. Additionally, I consulted with my accountants to reevaluate any financial obligations that had been set up during the wedding planning. While I had kept our finances largely separate, there were still shared arrangements, honeymoon deposits, vendor contracts, and property considerations that needed to be unraveled. I made sure everything was handled swiftly, with no lingering ties or outstanding debts that Emily or her family could use to cause problems later. Once the financial and legal aspects were contained, I turned my attention to the social fallout. The people who had attended the wedding represented a broad spectrum of both personal and professional connections, many of which were important to me outside of this specific situation. Allowing the story to spread unchecked could lead to unnecessary speculation and damage to my reputation, especially in circles where perception mattered. I had already issued a basic public relations statement through my PR team, but I needed to be more proactive in controlling the narrative going forward. My goal wasn't to smear Emily or her family, but rather to prevent gossip from taking root and to ensure that I emerged from this situation with my professional reputation intact. I scheduled private meetings with key individuals, business associates, clients, and family friends, people whose opinions carried weight. These meetings were planned carefully, often under the guise of normal business or social interactions, but each had the same purpose: to clarify the facts before rumors could take hold. I kept the information minimal but clear. The wedding had been called off due to a personal matter between myself and Emily, and it was a decision that couldn't be undone. I avoided offering too many details, focusing instead on reaffirming my stability and professionalism. It was crucial that these people saw me as in control of the situation, not as a victim of it. By presenting a calm and collected front, I ensured that the story would end with me, and not with Emily's family, dictating the narrative. For the broader social circle, those less integral to my professional life but still important in terms of maintaining appearances, I took a more hands-off approach. I had my PR team draft a follow-up statement that would be circulated informally through social channels. It reiterated the same points. The wedding was off, no further comment would be provided, and both parties were moving forward separately. This statement was carefully designed to close the door on the subject, leaving little room for ongoing speculation. It was deliberately neutral, without any inflammatory language, as I wanted to avoid giving Emily or her family any opportunity to engage in a public dispute. Despite my efforts, the story began to spread in smaller, less controllable circles. I had anticipated this. Friends of friends, acquaintances who had attended the wedding, and even a few vendors started talking. It wasn't long before a few tabloids picked up on the fact that the wedding had been abruptly called off. Though the news didn't make major headlines, the whispers were enough to warrant further action. I instructed my PR team to issue cease and desist orders to any media outlets that attempted to speculate beyond the official statement. While I couldn't stop all discussion, I could minimize its reach and ensure that no false or damaging information spread beyond the core facts. This was a necessary step in protecting my professional image and ensuring that my business relationships remained unaffected. One of the more challenging aspects of managing this external fallout was dealing with the personal relationships that had been intertwined with the wedding. In particular, the dynamic with my family required careful handling. My parents were, of course, disappointed by the sudden collapse of the wedding. They had invested their own time and effort into the event, and though they supported my decision, the strain on our family relationships was evident. I scheduled time to meet with them privately, ensuring that we could discuss the situation without the influence of outside opinions. During these meetings, I avoided emotional discussions, focusing instead on practical matters, what needed to be done moving forward, and how we would handle questions from extended family and friends. I made it clear that the wedding was over and that there would be no reconsideration. I asked for their support in maintaining this narrative, understanding that some relatives might push for more information or try to meddle. My parents, while still processing their own disappointment, agreed to follow my lead, recognizing the importance of keeping the family united in the face of public scrutiny. The situation with my brother David remained delicate. While we had spoken briefly about Emily's confession, there were still unanswered questions. His role, whether intentional or not, had become a central issue in the breakdown of the wedding, and I wasn't prepared to let that go unresolved. However, rather than confront him directly again, I chose to wait for the right moment. For now, my focus was on handling the external issues. David's involvement would be dealt with later, once the immediate fallout had been fully contained. To further solidify my position, I made plans to distance myself socially from Emily's family. We had shared connections, particularly through family friends and social events, but I began severing those ties one by one. I stopped attending any gatherings where her family would be present and instructed my staff to politely decline any future invitations that included them. It was essential that I remove myself from their influence entirely. There could be no lingering associations, no room for future conflicts to arise from our shared social circle. The final phase of this external strategy was to focus on reestablishing normalcy in my daily routine. My professional life required stability, and I needed to demonstrate that the events surrounding the wedding had not derailed my career. I returned to my regular work schedule, attended meetings, and ensured that my business operations continued without interruption. By showing that I remained in control of my professional responsibilities, I reinforced the narrative that the situation was behind me. Each of these decisions was made with the same goal in mind: to eliminate any potential threats to my personal and professional life that could arise from the aftermath of the wedding. I knew that the situation wasn't fully resolved yet. There were still loose ends to tie up with Emily and her family, but for now, I had managed to contain the damage and ensure that my life remained on track. I met Emily in the same park where we once planned our future together. Now everything had changed. Silently, I handed her an envelope. She opened it and saw a one-way ticket. Her eyes widened as she read the note inside. "I'm sure you know where you're headed now." She looked up at me, hoping for an explanation, but I didn't say a word. I just stood up and walked away, leaving her with the ticket in hand and no answers. If you like this story, subscribe right away and listen to new stories every day. Let us know what you like the most in the comments.